"Sir, that seat is reserved for someone important." The words floated across the VIP lounge loud enough for nearby travelers to hear, and within seconds, dozens of eyes turned toward the man sitting quietly by the window. Marcus Reynolds looked up from his laptop and met the manager's gaze. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, rain drifted across the airport runway in thin silver lines. Aircraft lights blinked through the evening haze while travelers hurried between terminals below. The lounge itself smelled faintly of fresh coffee, polished wood, and expensive cologne. It was the kind of place designed to make people feel important. Marcus glanced at the leather chair beneath him and then back at the woman standing nearby. Her name tag read Rachel Morgan. She wore a crisp navy blazer and the confident expression of someone who believed she was enforcing the rules. "Interesting," Marcus said calmly. Rachel folded her hands in front of her. "I am sorry, sir, but we need this seat available." A few feet away, a well-dressed passenger in a tailored gray suit looked up from his phone. Brandon Whitaker. He watched the exchange with growing interest. Marcus slowly closed his laptop. There was no irritation in his face. No argument. No demand to speak with a supervisor. "Is there a problem with my membership?" he asked. Rachel barely glanced at the gold access card resting beside his computer. "The issue is not your membership." Her answer came too quickly. Marcus noticed. So did a few people listening nearby. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere behind the coffee station, dishes clinked together. The lounge continued moving around them, but the conversation had become the center of attention. Rachel gestured toward another section of the room. "There are plenty of seats available over there." Marcus followed her gesture. The area she indicated sat near the entrance beside a television and a crowded refreshment station. Considerably less private. Considerably less comfortable. Brandon stood and adjusted his jacket. "If it helps," he said with a smile, "I do not mind taking this seat." Rachel immediately returned the smile. "Thank you, sir." Marcus noticed the difference. Not in her words. In her tone. Tiny details often revealed larger truths. He slipped his laptop into a leather bag and rose from the chair. The movement seemed to surprise Rachel. Perhaps she expected resistance. Instead, Marcus simply nodded. Of course. Several travelers exchanged glances as he stepped away from the window. Brandon settled comfortably into the seat almost immediately. The city lights reflected across the glass behind him. Rachel looked relieved, as though a problem had just been solved. Marcus walked toward the standard seating area without another word. The lounge slowly returned to normal conversation. Coffee machines hummed. Phones rang softly. Rolling suitcases crossed polished floors. Yet something lingered in the air. Marcus sat down at a small table near the back corner and reopened his laptop. His fingers moved across the keyboard with steady precision. Calm. Focused. Unbothered. Then his phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. He read it once and allowed the faintest smile to cross his face. Around him, nobody noticed. Nobody knew who he was. And nobody realized that the most expensive seat in the room had just become the least important thing about the evening. Brandon Whitaker leaned back in the leather chair and crossed one leg over the other as though he had just reclaimed something that belonged to him. The panoramic window beside him framed a line of aircraft taxiing through the rain, their navigation lights glowing red and white against the darkening evening sky. He glanced around the lounge and noticed a few people still watching. That only seemed to improve his mood. "Much better," he said casually to nobody in particular. Rachel Morgan smiled politely. "Please let us know if there is anything else you need." Brandon nodded and reached for a complimentary bottle of sparkling water. Around him, the lounge slowly settled back into its normal rhythm. Business travelers checked emails. Families waited for delayed departures. Television screens displayed weather updates and changing flight schedules. Yet every few minutes, Brandon found himself glancing toward the back corner where Marcus now sat alone. There was something unusual about him. Most people who felt embarrassed would leave. Others would complain. Marcus did neither. He simply continued working. The glow from his laptop illuminated his face while raindrops traced soft paths down the glass behind him. Rachel walked toward the service counter and began organizing paperwork. One of the younger employees approached quietly. "Was there actually a reservation issue?" he asked. Rachel barely looked up. "No," the employee hesitated. "Then why move him?" Rachel sighed. "Sometimes you have to make judgment calls." The young employee glanced toward Marcus. He seemed pretty calm about it. Rachel returned to her paperwork. Exactly. Across the lounge, Marcus reviewed several documents displayed on his screen. Financial reports, meeting summaries, acquisition timelines. The kind of information that usually involved dozens of executives and months of preparation. His phone vibrated again. This time the caller identification displayed a familiar name. Olivia Reynolds. Marcus answered immediately. "Hey, Dad." Her cheerful voice cut through the noise of the lounge. "Still at the airport?" Marcus smiled. "Unfortunately. Delay. A small one." Olivia laughed. "You always say that right before something complicated happens." Marcus looked toward the rain-covered runway. "You know me too well." She paused. "Everything okay?" For a moment, Marcus glanced across the room. Rachel was helping Brandon. Their conversation appeared friendly, comfortable, effortless. Then he looked back at his laptop. "Everything is fine," he said. And strangely enough, he meant it. Olivia began describing a presentation she was preparing for the following week. Marcus listened carefully, offering advice and encouragement. Anyone watching would have assumed he was simply a father talking to his daughter. Nobody would have guessed that several of the companies mentioned in the reports on his screen generated billions of dollars in annual revenue. When the call ended, Marcus closed his eyes briefly and listened to the sounds around him. Coffee machines steaming, quiet conversations, rolling luggage crossing marble floors. Airports had always fascinated him. People revealed themselves when they believed they would never be seen again. Near the service desk, the younger employee suddenly looked up from his terminal. His expression changed, then changed again. He stared at the screen for several seconds before quickly typing something. A photograph appeared beside a profile. The employee blinked. He looked toward Marcus, then back at the screen. His heartbeat quickened. Slowly, he stood from his chair. Because for the first time that evening, someone in the lounge was beginning to understand exactly who had been asked to give up that seat. The young employee's name was Ethan Parker, and for several seconds he simply stared at the screen in front of him as though it had suddenly switched languages. The profile photo matched perfectly. The same face, the same calm expression, the same man sitting alone near the back of the lounge beside the rain-covered windows. Ethan quickly checked the information again. Then a third time. His pulse accelerated. Across the room, Marcus Reynolds remained focused on his work, occasionally typing notes while aircraft lights moved slowly through the darkness outside. He looked like an ordinary traveler waiting for a delayed flight. That was exactly what made the discovery so difficult to believe. Ethan swallowed hard and quietly opened another page within the system. Partnership records, corporate accounts, executive access privileges. The list seemed endless. His eyes widened. Nearby, Rachel Morgan continued assisting guests at the service desk. She noticed Ethan staring at the monitor. "Everything okay?" she asked casually. Ethan hesitated. "I think so." Rachel returned to helping another customer. Ethan lowered his voice and called over a coworker. "Come look at this." The second employee leaned closer. A few seconds later, his expression changed too. "No way." Ethan nodded slowly. "That is what I thought." Both men looked toward Marcus. The contrast was almost absurd. One of the most influential business leaders in the state was sitting alone beside a crowded television, drinking airport coffee and working quietly on a laptop. No security detail, no assistance, no special treatment, just patience. Near the window seating area, Brandon Whitaker checked messages on his phone and smiled at something he read. He appeared completely comfortable. Every now and then he glanced around the lounge with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to receiving preferential treatment. Rachel passed by and asked if he needed anything else. "I am good," Brandon replied. "This seat has a great view." Rachel smiled. "I am glad you are comfortable." Across the room, Marcus looked up briefly. Not at Brandon, not at Rachel. Instead, he watched a small family rushing through the terminal below. A little girl struggled to keep up with her parents while dragging a bright red suitcase almost half her size. Marcus smiled faintly. Then he returned to work. The moment lasted only seconds, but Ethan noticed it. There was something strangely grounding about Marcus. No visible frustration, no resentment, just quiet observation. Ethan finally stood and approached Rachel. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Rachel glanced at him. "What is it?" Ethan lowered his voice. "The gentleman you moved earlier." Rachel immediately looked annoyed. "What about him?" Ethan glanced around to make sure nobody else could hear. "You should probably look at his profile." Rachel folded her arms. Why? Ethan hesitated. Because I think you may want to know who he is. Rachel sighed and followed him toward the terminal workstation. Her expression suggested she expected to waste 30 seconds proving a junior employee wrong. Ethan pulled up the account information and stepped aside. Rachel's eyes moved across the screen. Her confidence remained unchanged for the first few seconds. Then she read another line. And another. The smile disappeared. Outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond the airport. Inside, the noise of the lounge seemed to fade around her. Slowly, Rachel looked toward the back corner where Marcus sat quietly beneath the glow of his laptop screen. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Rachel Morgan stared at the screen longer than she intended. The account profile remained unchanged no matter how many times she read it. Strategic partner, executive access, advisory board member, multiple priority designations attached to the same name. Marcus Reynolds. She felt a subtle tightening in her chest. Beside her, Ethan remained silent. He was wise enough not to say what both of them were thinking. Across the lounge, Marcus continued working as though nothing had happened. The glow from his laptop reflected softly against the window while rain traced silver patterns across the glass behind him. Rachel looked back at the screen, then toward Marcus again. The contrast felt impossible. Important people usually announce themselves. They arrived with assistants, expensive luggage, and an expectation that everyone would notice. Marcus had done none of those things. He had simply shown his membership card and accepted her decision without argument. Maybe it is an old profile, Rachel said quietly. Even to her own ears, the explanation sounded weak. Ethan shook his head. The system updated this afternoon. Rachel swallowed. Around them, the lounge continued operating normally. Coffee machines hissed. Travelers checked departure boards. A television near the entrance displayed weather delays affecting flights across the region. Yet Rachel felt as though the room had suddenly become much smaller. A few feet away, Brandon Whitaker remained comfortably seated beside the panoramic window. He was speaking on his phone now, occasionally laughing at something being said on the other end. Every few minutes he glanced across the lounge, seemingly unaware of the growing tension near the service desk. Rachel watched him for a moment before looking back at Marcus. The memory of their earlier interaction replayed in her mind. His calm voice, his willingness to move, the way he had asked whether there was a problem with his membership. At the time, she had barely considered the question. Now it sounded different. Near the back corner, Marcus paused his work and reached for a paper cup of coffee. The drink had cooled considerably, yet he seemed unbothered. He took a sip and returned to reading a document on his screen. The behavior struck Rachel more than anything else. He had every reason to complain, every reason to demand answers. Instead, he appeared focused on something far more important than a lounge seat. Ethan's computer suddenly chimed. A new notification appeared in the corner of the screen. Rachel glanced down. Then her eyes widened. The message came directly from Airport Corporate Relations. It contained only one sentence. Confirm accommodation status for Mr. Marcus Reynolds immediately. Rachel felt the color drain from her face. Corporate Relations rarely contacted lounge staff directly. The department handled major partnerships, executive accounts, and high-level stakeholders. Ethan read the message too. Neither spoke. Outside, lightning flashed beyond the runway, illuminating the airport in brief white light. Inside, Rachel slowly realized that events were already moving beyond her control. She looked toward Marcus once more. He happened to glance up at the same moment. Their eyes met across the lounge. Marcus offered a polite nod. Nothing more. No anger. No accusation. Just courtesy. Somehow that made Rachel feel even worse. Because for the first time that evening, she was beginning to understand that the real problem had never been a seat. The real problem was the assumption she had made before she knew who was sitting in it. The notification remained on Rachel Morgan's screen long after she had finished reading it. Confirm accommodation status for Mr. Marcus Reynolds immediately. For words continued echoing in her mind. Immediately. She had worked at the airport for nearly 7 years and had never received a message from corporate relations with that level of urgency. Beside her, Ethan Parker quietly returned to his workstation, sensing that whatever happened next would not involve him. Across the lounge, Marcus sat exactly where he had been for the past hour. Calm, focused, unmoved. The rain outside had become heavier now, drumming softly against the enormous windows overlooking the runway. Airport lights reflected across the glass like scattered gold coins, while distant aircraft waited for departure clearance beneath the storm clouds. Rachel took a slow breath and stepped away from the desk. She intended to walk over and apologize immediately. At least that was the plan. Halfway across the lounge, however, her phone began ringing. She glanced at the screen. Airport operations. Her stomach tightened. Rachel Morgan speaking. The voice on the other end sounded unusually serious. "Rachel, this is Thomas Reed." She straightened instantly. Everyone at the airport knew Thomas Reed. As director of operations, he rarely contacted lounge managers directly. "Good evening, sir. I need you to answer one question honestly." Rachel felt her pulse quicken. "Of course." A brief pause followed. "Has Marcus Reynolds experienced any service issues this evening?" Rachel stared through the lounge. Marcus was looking out at the storm beyond the windows now, his laptop temporarily closed. He seemed more interested in watching aircraft lights move through the rain than anything happening around him. "There was a seating adjustment," Rachel said carefully. Silence followed. Then another few seconds passed. "A seating adjustment," Thomas repeated. Rachel suddenly realized how weak the explanation sounded. "Yes." More silence. She heard papers moving on the other end of the line. "Rachel, do you know who Marcus Reynolds is?" She closed her eyes briefly. "I do now." Thomas exhaled slowly. "That is what I was afraid of." Near the window, Brandon Whitaker continued enjoying the premium seat. He ordered another drink and smiled as an attendant brought it over. Completely unaware. Completely comfortable. Meanwhile, Rachel felt as though the room were shifting beneath her feet. "Sir," she asked quietly, "how serious is this?" Another pause. Then Thomas answered, "That depends entirely on how the situation happened." The words settled heavily in her chest. Across the lounge, Marcus reopened his laptop and resumed working. No complaints. No angry phone calls. No public confrontation. Rachel had never seen anything like it. Most influential travelers demanded attention. Marcus seemed determined to avoid it. Thomas spoke again. "I will be arriving shortly." "Personally?" Rachel asked before she could stop herself. "Yes." The call ended. Rachel lowered the phone slowly. Around her, the lounge continued operating as though nothing had changed. Travelers laughed. Coffee machines hissed. Flight announcements echoed faintly through the terminal beyond the doors. Yet Rachel knew something important was unfolding. She looked toward Marcus once more. At that exact moment, another notification appeared on her screen. Executive Partner Review activated. Rachel froze, because she suddenly realized this was no longer about a lounge seat, a customer complaint, or a misunderstanding. Somewhere beyond the airport, people with far greater authority than hers had already started paying attention. Marcus Reynolds closed the final document on his laptop and leaned back slightly in his chair. The storm outside had transformed the runway into a sea of reflections. White landing lights stretched across the wet pavement, while service vehicles moved through the rain like shadows beneath the night sky. Around him, travelers continued checking phones, answering emails, and watching departure boards. To most people, it was simply another delayed evening at the airport. Marcus glanced at his watch. Then his phone vibrated. A new message appeared from Olivia. "Did your flight finally get moving?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Not yet," he typed. A few seconds later, another message arrived. "You sound suspiciously calm." Marcus chuckled quietly. Some situations are more educational than frustrating. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked around the lounge. Across the room, Rachel Morgan stood near the service desk pretending to review reports. In reality, her attention kept drifting toward him every few minutes. The confidence she carried earlier had been replaced by uncertainty. She was beginning to understand that the evening was no longer unfolding the way she expected. Near the panoramic window, Brandon Whitaker remained completely unaware. He was discussing business on a video call, occasionally laughing and gesturing toward the runway behind him. The premium seat had become part of his temporary office. Marcus watched for a moment before returning his attention to the rain. The seat itself no longer mattered. In truth, it had stopped mattering almost immediately. What interested him now was everything that followed. Character always revealed itself after a decision was made. At the service desk, Rachel's phone rang again. She answered immediately. Rachel speaking. "This is Thomas Reed." His voice sounded closer this time. "I just arrived at the terminal." Rachel straightened. Sir, do not approach Mr. Reynolds yet. The instruction surprised her. You do not want me to apologize? Not until I understand exactly what happened. Rachel looked across the lounge toward Marcus. Understood. The call ended. Her stomach tightened. A few moments later, the main lounge doors opened. Thomas Reed stepped inside, carrying a rain-speckled coat over one arm. Several employees immediately recognized him. Conversations softened. Thomas acknowledged them with a nod before scanning the room. His eyes found Marcus almost instantly. For a brief moment, he simply stood there. Then he began walking across the lounge. Ethan noticed first. Rachel noticed second. Neither spoke. Marcus looked up from his laptop as Thomas approached. Mr. Reynolds. Thomas extended his hand. Good evening. Marcus stood and shook it warmly. Thomas. It has been a while. The familiarity between them caught Rachel completely off guard. These were not strangers meeting for the first time. Thomas smiled. Far too long. Marcus gestured toward an empty chair. Please. The two men sat together beside the window overlooking the storm. Their conversation remained private, their voices too low for anyone else to hear. Yet the visual alone was enough. The director of airport operations had crossed an entire terminal to personally meet the man she had asked to leave a VIP seat. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. Because as rain continued falling beyond the glass and aircraft lights shimmered across the darkness, one truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Whatever authority she thought Marcus Reynolds possessed, she had underestimated it by a very large margin. Thomas Reed listened more than he spoke. That was something Marcus Reynolds had always respected about him. While rain continued falling beyond the glass, the two men sat overlooking the runway as aircraft lights drifted through the darkness. Around them, the lounge carried on with its usual rhythm, but an invisible tension had settled over the room. Employees noticed it. Travelers sensed it. Nobody fully understood it. I appreciate you coming personally, Marcus said. Thomas nodded. I wanted facts before assumptions. A faint smile appeared on Marcus's face. That is becoming a rare quality. Thomas glanced briefly toward the service desk, where Rachel Morgan stood reviewing reports she was no longer reading. I understand there was a situation. Marcus folded his hands. There was a decision. Thomas studied him carefully. And Marcus looked toward the rain-covered runway. What interests me is not the seat. The answer surprised him. Then what interests you? Marcus remained silent for several seconds. The reason behind the decision. Across the lounge, Rachel noticed Thomas take notes. Her stomach tightened further. She had expected an angry customer. She had expected complaints and demands. Instead, she was watching a conversation that felt far more serious. Near the window seating area, Brandon Whitaker finally noticed Thomas sitting with Marcus. At first, he seemed confused, then curious. He lowered his phone and watched from a distance. Back at the service desk, Ethan's terminal suddenly emitted a notification tone. He glanced down. A priority message had arrived from corporate headquarters. The subject line immediately caught his attention. Executive Partner Review Committee. Ethan opened it. His eyes widened. Rachel. She walked over immediately. What now? Ethan turned the monitor toward her. The message contained a list of recipients. Airport executives, corporate compliance officers, customer experience directors, legal review staff. More names than she could count. And at the center of the review request appeared one name. Marcus Reynolds. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. Why would all these people be involved? Ethan slowly scrolled downward. Attached beneath the message was a profile summary. Not the shortened version she had seen earlier. The complete version. Strategic investor. Regional development partner. Advisory board member. Infrastructure funding contributor. Rachel stared at the screen. The deeper she read, the worse she felt. Across the room, Marcus's phone vibrated. He glanced at the message and immediately recognized the sender. Olivia again. This time the text was shorter. Did the meeting report go through? Marcus smiled faintly. Yes. Right on schedule. He slipped the phone away. Thomas noticed. Something important? Marcus looked back toward the runway. Potentially. At that exact moment, another notification arrived inside the corporate system. This one appeared simultaneously on executive screens across multiple departments. Review activated. Immediate assessment required. Employee actions under examination. Rachel watched the words appear. Then she looked toward Marcus once more. He remained calm. Calm in a way that no ordinary traveler would be. calm in a way that suggested events were unfolding exactly as expected. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant horizon. Inside, Rachel finally understood something she should have realized hours ago. Marcus Reynolds had never needed the VIP seat. The people around him needed the opportunity to show how they treated someone they believed was not important. And now, somewhere far above her position and far beyond her authority, people were beginning to examine exactly what they had revealed. The storm outside finally began to weaken, but inside the airport a different kind of weather was building. High above the lounge floor, inside offices most travelers would never see, screens were lighting up one after another. Reports were being opened. Messages were being forwarded. Names were being added to review chains. None of the passengers sipping coffee below knew any of it was happening. Marcus Reynolds certainly did. Yet he remained exactly where he had been all evening. Calm, patient, observant. Across from him, Thomas Reed reviewed several documents on a tablet before setting it aside. "I have watched this airport grow for 20 years, he said quietly. Most problems announce themselves loudly. Marcus glanced toward the runway. The important ones rarely do. Thomas nodded. He understood exactly what Marcus meant. Near the service desk, Rachel Morgan felt trapped between uncertainty and dread. Every few minutes another message arrived. Some came from supervisors. Others came from departments she had never communicated with before. The questions were all similar. What happened? Who made the decision? Was policy followed? Each message seemed more serious than the last. Ethan sat nearby reading updates from the internal system. Then another alert appeared. This one carried a higher priority level. Review footage requested. Rachel immediately leaned closer. Footage? Ethan nodded slowly. Security wants the lounge recordings. The words landed heavily. Rachel stared at the screen. Security footage meant timelines. Timelines meant facts. Facts meant there would be no room for interpretation. Across the lounge, Brandon Whitaker ended another phone call and finally noticed the growing tension among the employees. He looked around with mild confusion. Something had clearly changed. Staff members who had been relaxed earlier now seemed distracted. Several glanced toward Marcus before quickly looking away. Brandon followed their gaze. For a brief moment, he watched Marcus speaking quietly with Thomas Reed. "Who is that guy?" he muttered under his breath. Nobody answered. Near the window, Marcus received another call. This time he answered immediately. "Good evening." The voice on the other end belonged to a senior executive. "The committee has reviewed the preliminary findings." Marcus remained silent. "They would like your recommendation." Thomas looked over, but said nothing. Marcus watched a jet climb slowly into the night sky before responding. "Recommendations should come after facts." The executive paused. "Understood." The call ended. Thomas smiled faintly. Most people would already be demanding consequences. Marcus folded his hands. Most people are not interested in learning why something happened. The answer lingered between them. Meanwhile, inside a conference room several floors above the terminal, security personnel began reviewing lounge footage. The video showed everything. Marcus arriving quietly. Rachel approaching. The conversation near the window. Brandon taking the seat. Marcus leaving without complaint. The footage contained no dramatic confrontation. No argument. No raised voices. Yet the more they watched, the more uncomfortable the room became. Because the issue was not what had been said. It was what had been assumed. Back in the lounge, Rachel suddenly received a final message. Mandatory executive review scheduled. Attendance required. Her hands became cold. She read the message twice. Then a third time. Across the room, Marcus closed his laptop and stood. The movement immediately drew attention. Travelers looked up. Employees watched. Even Brandon straightened in his seat. Marcus slipped his computer into a leather bag and looked toward the rain-streaked runway one last time. Then he turned toward Thomas. "I believe the next part of this conversation will happen somewhere else." Thomas nodded. "I believe you are right." And for the first time that evening, several people realized that the story was no longer staying inside the lounge. Marcus Reynolds lifted his leather bag and walked beside Thomas Reed toward the lounge exit. Neither man appeared hurried. Yet their calm movement seemed to pull the attention of the entire room with them. Conversations softened. Travelers glanced up from laptops. Employees paused in the middle of routine tasks. Even Brandon Whitaker lowered his phone and watched as the two men crossed the polished floor together. The rain outside had almost stopped now, leaving long reflections across the runway like ribbons of silver beneath the airport lights. Near the service desk, Rachel Morgan felt her pulse quicken as Marcus approached. For a brief moment, she considered speaking, apologizing, explaining, doing something to stop the growing feeling that events were moving beyond her reach. But the words never came. Marcus offered the same polite nod he had given earlier. Nothing more. No anger. No sarcasm. No attempt to embarrass her. Then he continued walking. Somehow that quiet courtesy felt heavier than criticism would have. Thomas glanced toward Rachel before following Marcus through the lounge doors. The moment they disappeared into the terminal corridor, the room seemed to exhale. Brandon stood and approached the service desk. "Okay," he said with a nervous laugh. "Who exactly was that guy?" Rachel looked at him but did not answer immediately. Ethan did. "Marcus Reynolds." Brandon shrugged. "Should I know that name?" Ethan stared at him. Apparently everyone at corporate does. The answer erased Brandon's smile. Meanwhile, several floors above the terminal, the executive review team continued examining reports. Security footage played on a large screen while compliance officers compared timelines and employee statements. No one in the room appeared excited. If anything, they looked concerned. One senior reviewer paused the video on a frame showing Marcus quietly gathering his belongings after being asked to leave the premium seat. "Did he complain at any point?" she asked. "No." Raise his voice. "No." Request special treatment? "No." The room fell silent. Another reviewer leaned forward. "Then why does this feel worse?" Nobody answered because everyone already understood. The issue was never his reaction. The issue was the decision that came before it. Back in the terminal corridor, Marcus and Thomas entered a private conference room overlooking the airfield. The room was simple. A long table, several chairs, large windows facing the runways. Airport lights shimmered against the wet pavement outside. Thomas placed a folder on the table. "The committee wants a full review tomorrow morning." Marcus sat down and looked through the glass. A departing aircraft accelerated into the darkness before lifting smoothly into the night sky. "That seems reasonable." Thomas studied him carefully. "You are taking this remarkably well." Marcus smiled faintly. The seat was never the important part. Thomas already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. "Then what was?" Marcus watched the aircraft disappear into the clouds. Whether people apply standards equally when they believe nobody important is watching. The room became quiet. Outside, the storm finally moved beyond the airport. Inside, another message arrived on multiple executive screens throughout the organization. Mandatory leadership attendance. Final review session scheduled. And for the first time that evening, people far above Rachel Morgan's position began realizing that tomorrow morning would not be about a VIP seat at all. It would be about the culture that created the decision. The next morning arrived beneath clear skies as though the storm had never happened. Sunlight spilled across the airport campus, reflecting from glass walls and polished steel. Yet inside the executive conference center, the atmosphere remained heavy. Long before the meeting officially began, senior managers had already filled the room. Some reviewed reports. Others sat quietly staring at screens displaying timelines, policy summaries, and security footage. Nobody seemed interested in small talk. Rachel Morgan arrived 15 minutes early and still found herself among the last people entering. She chose a seat near the end of the table and folded her hands tightly in her lap. The room felt colder than usual. Around her sat department directors, compliance officers, customer experience executives, and operations leaders. People whose decisions affected thousands of travelers every day. At precisely 9 o'clock, Thomas Reed entered carrying a thin folder. Conversations stopped immediately. He placed the folder on the table and looked around the room. "Thank you for being here." His voice remained calm. "This review concerns a service decision that occurred yesterday evening inside the executive lounge." A large screen illuminated behind him. Security footage appeared. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. The video began playing. Marcus entering the lounge. Marcus presenting his credentials. Marcus sitting quietly beside the window. Then Rachel approaching. The room watched in complete silence. No one interrupted. No one commented. They simply observed. When the footage reached the moment Marcus gathered his belongings and moved to the standard seating area, Thomas paused the video. "At any point," he asked, "did the guest refuse instructions?" Several people reviewed notes. "No." "Did the guest behave aggressively?" "No." Did the guest create a disturbance? No, Thomas nodded. The screen changed. A profile summary appeared. Strategic partner. Infrastructure investor. Advisory board member. Several executives shifted in their seats. One compliance officer looked up. How many active projects involve Mr. Reynolds? 23. Another executive answered. Current value? A brief pause followed. Several $100 million. The room became even quieter. Rachel stared at the table. She already knew Marcus was important. What she had not understood was the scale. Thomas continued. That information is relevant, but it is not the central issue. The screen changed again. This time a single sentence appeared. Standards must be applied consistently. Thomas looked around the room. The concern is not how an influential person was treated. The concern is whether the same decision would have been made if assumptions had been different. Nobody answered. The silence itself felt like an answer. Then the conference room doors opened. Every head turned. Marcus Reynolds entered carrying the same leather bag he had carried through the airport the night before. No entourage. No attorney. No assistants. Just Marcus. He greeted Thomas with a nod before taking a seat at the far end of the table. Rachel felt her heartbeat accelerate. Several executives straightened immediately. Others closed laptops and gave him their full attention. Marcus placed his bag beside his chair and looked around the room. His expression remained calm, thoughtful, measured. Then he folded his hands and spoke for the first time. Before anyone discusses consequences, he said quietly, I would like us to discuss something far more important. And the moment those words left his mouth, everyone in the room understood that the real meeting was only beginning. Marcus Reynolds allowed the silence to settle across the conference room before speaking again. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long reflections across the polished table. Around him sat executives, managers, compliance officers, and department leaders who had spent the last 12 hours examining reports and reviewing footage. Yet none of those documents seemed as important as the question Marcus was about to ask. He looked around the room calmly. How many people here believe this meeting is about me? Several uncomfortable glances followed. Nobody raised a hand. Marcus nodded slightly. Good. Because it is not. Rachel Morgan sat motionless near the end of the table. Every word felt directed toward the entire organization rather than any individual person. Marcus folded his hands. Yesterday, I walked into an airport lounge as an ordinary traveler. Most people did not know my name. Most people did not know my position. And that should not have mattered. The room remained silent. The purpose of a standard is that it applies equally. The purpose of professionalism is that it does not change based on appearances. Thomas Reed watched several executives lower their eyes. Marcus continued, I have spent decades in boardrooms. I have negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet none of those experiences concern me as much as a simple question. He paused. How do we treat people when we believe they cannot affect our careers? Nobody answered. The question lingered over the room like a weight. Marcus stood and walked slowly toward the large screen displaying the security footage timeline. Yesterday was not the first time someone made assumptions about me. His voice remained calm, and it will not be the last. He turned back toward the group. But every assumption creates a choice to be fair or unfair, respectful or dismissive, curious or judgmental. Rachel felt her throat tighten. For the first time, she understood that the issue extended far beyond a seat assignment. Marcus looked directly at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, simply with honesty. Rachel, when you approached me, did you know who I was? She shook her head. No. And if you had known? The question hung in the air. Rachel took a breath. I would have handled it differently. Marcus nodded. That is exactly the problem. The room became perfectly still. Because nobody should receive better treatment because they are powerful. They should receive fair treatment because they are human. Several executives exchanged thoughtful looks. Thomas leaned back quietly, allowing Marcus to continue. I am not interested in punishment for the sake of punishment. I am interested in understanding why the decision happened and how to prevent similar decisions in the future. The words seemed to release some of the tension from the room. Marcus returned to his seat. Outside the windows, an aircraft lifted into the bright morning sky. Inside, people who had arrived expecting a disciplinary meeting were beginning to realize they were participating in something much larger. This was not a discussion about one employee or one traveler. It was a discussion about values. And for the first time since the review began, the room was finally ready to confront them honestly. For several moments after Marcus finished speaking, nobody said a word. The conference room remained wrapped in a thoughtful silence unlike anything Rachel Morgan had experienced before. Sunlight continued moving slowly across the polished table, while aircraft rose and descended beyond the glass walls overlooking the airfield. The atmosphere no longer felt defensive. It felt reflective. Thomas Reed finally stood and opened the folder he had carried into the meeting. The review committee has completed its findings. Several executives straightened in their seats. Rachel felt her heartbeat quicken again. Thomas looked around the room before continuing. The investigation found no violation based on a single action alone. The concern was a pattern of decision-making influenced by assumptions rather than objective standards. Nobody appeared surprised. They had all watched the footage. They had all read the reports. Thomas continued. The committee also found that existing training programs failed to adequately address consistency in customer treatment. Several department leaders exchanged uncomfortable looks. The responsibility clearly extended beyond one person. Marcus listened quietly. He had not come for vindication. That much was obvious now. Thomas closed the folder and looked toward Rachel. Rachel Morgan. She sat up immediately. Yes, sir. The committee has determined that corrective action is appropriate. However, the committee also recognizes your cooperation, honesty, and willingness to participate fully in the review process. Rachel listened carefully. Effective immediately, you will enter an executive development and leadership accountability program. Your performance will be reviewed over the next 6 months. Relief mixed with embarrassment inside her chest. She had prepared herself for something far worse. Thomas then turned toward the larger group. In addition, all lounge management personnel will complete updated training focused on equitable customer service standards. Several executives nodded. Notes were already being taken. Marcus watched quietly from his seat near the end of the table. Finally, Thomas looked toward him. Mr. Reynolds, would you like to add anything before we conclude? Marcus stood slowly. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass behind him. Beyond the windows, a passenger aircraft rolled toward the runway beneath a bright blue sky. Only one thing. The room became still again. Marcus looked around at every person present. People often think fairness means treating important people well. He paused briefly. That is not fairness. Nobody interrupted. Fairness means treating ordinary people with the same respect you would offer someone important. Several employees lowered their eyes. Others nodded slowly. Marcus continued. Yesterday, I happened to be the person involved. Tomorrow it could be someone whose name nobody recognizes. Someone who cannot call a board member. Someone who cannot influence a contract. That is the person standards are meant to protect. The words landed gently but powerfully. Rachel felt them more deeply than anyone. Because for the first time, she understood the true lesson. This had never been about a seat. It had never been about status. It had been about the assumptions made before knowing anything at all. Marcus gathered his bag and prepared to leave. Several executives stood as he did. Not because protocol required it. Because respect had finally replaced assumption. And as the meeting drew toward its conclusion, the room understood that accountability had been delivered. But something far more valuable had been gained as well. Marcus Reynolds stepped out of the conference room carrying the same leather bag he had carried into the airport the day before. The meeting was over. The reports had been reviewed. The decisions had been made. Yet what stayed with him was not the outcome. It was the silence that followed understanding. Behind him, executives slowly gathered their notes and returned to their responsibilities. Through the glass walls of the conference center, sunlight poured across the terminal complex, turning the wet pavement from last night's storm into sheets of gold. Travelers moved through the airport below, dragging suitcases, checking departure screens, and beginning journeys of their own. Most of them would never know what had happened inside the building that morning. And that was perfectly fine with Marcus. Near the elevator lobby, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned and saw Rachel Morgan. She stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rachel took a breath. I wanted to thank you. Marcus looked at her calmly. For what? She lowered her eyes briefly before meeting his gaze again. For giving me the chance to learn instead of simply becoming an example. Marcus smiled faintly. What you do with the opportunity matters more than what happened yesterday. Rachel nodded. I understand that now. The elevator doors opened behind her. Before stepping inside, she paused one final time. "I will not forget this." Marcus nodded. "Neither will I." The doors closed softly, and she disappeared from view. Marcus continued toward the terminal windows overlooking the runway. Aircraft rose into the bright blue sky one after another, climbing steadily above the city. For a few minutes, he simply stood there watching. His phone vibrated. A message from Olivia appeared. "How did the meeting go?" Marcus looked across the airfield and smiled. Then he typed a short reply. "Better than expected." Almost immediately another message arrived. That usually means something important happened. Marcus considered the question. Then he answered. People listened. He slipped the phone into his pocket and continued watching the planes. Across the terminal, employees returned to work. New travelers arrived. New conversations began. The airport kept moving forward. So did life. Thomas Reed eventually joined him near the glass. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "You could have made things much harder for a lot of people." Marcus nodded slightly. "Maybe." Thomas looked toward the runway. "Why did you not?" Marcus watched a departing jet disappear into the distance. Because fear changes behavior for a moment. Understanding changes it for much longer. Thomas smiled. "That sounds like something worth remembering." Marcus returned the smile. "I hope someone does." A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Marcus adjusted the strap of his bag and turned toward his gate. The sunlight followed him across the polished floor. No crowd gathered. No dramatic farewell unfolded. Just one man continuing his journey. Behind him, an organization had been forced to look honestly at itself. Ahead of him, another ordinary day waited. And as he disappeared into the flow of travelers moving through the airport, one truth remained. He never wanted special treatment. He only wanted the kind of respect every person deserves before anyone knows their name.